fair that we start and people will join along as well. So, friends, welcome. Many thanks for all of you all for joining. It's a Saturday morning, and of course, Asim, many thanks for agreeing to be the first chat participant. This is the first in our series on conversations with people like you and other people from the business and the industry. So, I want to welcome all those who have joined, and of course, those who will join. Uh, Let me start by introducing Asim. Although to many of you, he probably doesn't need an introduction, but Asim is a CA and CWA by education, a banker by experience, and an entrepreneurial person by practice. He spent about 2 decades with HDFC Bank and has built multiple verticals at the bank during that tenure. He was the founding director in HDB Financial Services and also the MD and CEO of HDFC Securities at some time. Currently, in his entrepreneurial role, he is the MD and CEO of SBFC Finance Private Limited, which is an MSME lender building a phygital. That's a new word I learned. This is a combination of physical and digital. A phygital model for reaching out to the real undeserved segments of small businesses. They have an AUM of approximately 3,000 crores, 125 branches, and 100 towns and cities across the country. So that's a quick, brief introduction on Asim. And Asim, once again, many thanks for joining and agreeing to this chat. And I'm sure we'll have a fabulous chat with you over the next 1 hour. The way we've structured it is that I've got a series of some questions which I will put to Asim, and then of course I'll ask him collaterals. And we've left about 15 minutes towards the end of the hour to answer any questions that any of the participants has. So my request to all of you all is, if whatever question you have, you can put it into the chat, into the questions in the chat. We will address them. Asim will address them as much as we can during the time that we do have. So let me start. And Asim, my first question to you is that you have been in the field of banking with some immense experience over the last 2 decades. How do you see the evolution from, say, 20 years or 25 years ago when all this started, when the new private sector banks came in? So how do you see that evolution? And of course, then the next step is, where will it go? But we can answer that question later.
So, first of all, thank you for having me. To answer this specific question, banking is the oldest profession in the world, and right going back to the days of Shylocks and the Jews, nothing much has really changed in the basics of the business. But what has changed is the way the business has been delivered over time. So the basics of the business remains the same. That people who have extra money, excess money, park it, and the bank is the intermediary where they will then go and identify opportunities where they can lend to people who need to borrow and make the profits of interest in between. So the basics of the business remains the same, but the approach of the business has changed with time. So if you go back to the 1980s and go back to the situation where you had nationalized banks only, and you took a token and you sat you entered a bank branch which had two half drawn iron curtains and with a lock hanging in between and a security guard with a gun standing outside, and then you went in and you took a token and sat to withdraw your own money. And from there things evolved where it became with the onset of internet and with the onset of technologies like ATM, phone banking, etc., the need to go to a bank to transact started dropping. So the first big change came when direct banking channels came through, and you had the host of phone banking, net banking, mobile banking, and ATM, which basically completed whatever the customer wanted to do in the bank. Now he could do it from the comfort of his home or at an ATM nearby. The fact that Visa and MasterCard linked the ATMs made it even more powerful, that it did not matter which bank you were banking with. You could take money out from an ATM, which was most convenient to you. So earlier you had to go to a nationalized bank before they became core banking system enabled, where you had to withdraw it from the same branch in which you had an account. From there, it became agnostic. You could withdraw it from any part of the world using any ATM of any bank. That was the next step of evaluation. The next evolution happened when it is saying that banking is required, but banks may not be. So more and more it becomes that bank should be a service provider at the background, enabling services to customers that they need. without the need of having customers walk into the physical premises. So what happens? The math for bank change. For example, if 1,000 square feet branch could earlier take not more than because about 0.5% of your customers may show up on a monthly basis to transact something. So if you had that 1 million accounts, it is impossible to manage it within that 1,000 square feet branch that you would have. But with customers now moving their stuff out, and with the advent of the next wave of technology, which brought in NPCI. So NPCI became the next big revolution in banking, where payment services went into a different level. So combination of what NPCI enabled, a combination of what the wallets contributed towards. Banks build their own wallets, other companies build their wallets. Payment system in India transited completely. So now if you see from early 2000, we had something called a high value clearing, where if there was a check more than 1 lakh, it had to be deposited in a branch close to church gate. Only then it will get cleared within the same day. Otherwise, it would take that sweet time, 15 days, 20 days to get one check cleared. If it is outstation, it went to the physical check went to another city, and got cashed in. So from there, it became, today it is 24 hours. So there's round the clock. You can move money to anyone round the clock. So today the reality is that you may be with an X bank, but it doesn't matter which bank you are with. You can transact literally from anywhere, anytime. So that became one big change. Second is that banks wanted to become more than just financial transactors, and they went into value added services. So as a bank, they wanted a higher share of the wallet, and they went after all services which are wealth management services, investment in mutual funds, insurance, etc., which became the next wave of growth. So banks now became a window for customers to manage two things. See, what does a customer really manage in a savings account? Only two things: either there is expenditure or there is investment. So as a bank, you became a conduit through which you make both of this possible. And if the customer tomorrow wants to borrow using technology, using things, the things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, pre-approved offers, using data warehouse technologies, banks were able to deliver online real-time loans to customers that they had chosen for. So banking as a business may not have evolved, and changed much, but banking as a delivery and an experience has changed a lot.
Yep, that's a good one. Yeah. Okay, so let me fast forward a little and jump to a topic which I think has been the hottest kind of topic for the last 1 year, which is the pandemic, the whole COVID situation and the impact on banking. How do you see that evolving now that hopefully things are going back to people, getting back to their normal businesses, and we talk of V curves growth and W curve growths, but there will be an impact. And how do you see that evolving from the banking sector across banks? Because you also have microfinance companies and small banks like yours who are probably a little more at risk in terms of the cash flows of the profile of your customers. So where do you see that going? And specifically, do you see banks getting risk averse? Do you see NPAs getting bad once this whole provisioning thing and restructuring thing is sorted out? And how will that pan out?
Banks are a proxy on the economy. So to that extent, banks do not have a life of their own. Banks do as the economy does. So the underlying economy takes a dive. If the underlying customer cash flows take a dive, the bank will have the impact washed through its own P&L and balance sheet. So first is that the impact of anything will depend on the impact of the larger society at large. Now, what has the pandemic done? The pandemic has actually done 3-4 things. One is that there was a trend towards formalization that began with demonetization, increased with GST, and with this has even accelerated more. So what have you seen? That the big companies have done much better. The smaller businesses have taken bigger hits. So the big has got bigger. I mean, if you look at the Sensex results, you'll be amazed as to how good they have been. And companies from pipes to automobiles, and from wires to paints, the entire range of companies have had extraordinarily top line growth even during the pandemic months. So when a company like Asian Paints talks of 40% increase in sales, or it is really something amazing. So the what is happening is that one, the formal sector, is growing a little more at the cost of small businesses. The second is that the rich have become richer in the pandemic, and the poor have lost out on cash flows. The rich have saved $200 billion more during the pandemic. They've spent less. So that is the second trend, that you see play out. The third is that there was anyway a move towards things moving online, things moving digital over time. This has accelerated that trend. So whether it was home delivery by restaurants, by things like Zoom that we are right now a part of, it was anyway moving towards this direction. It has moved much faster. So now instead of physically going and buying vegetables, you may be more tempted to buy from Amazon, Fresh or Big Basket, etc. So you get it at the convenience of your home. So that trend has played out. Now, what is going to likely happen is that the one good thing is that the margins of lenders have actually expanded. Cost of fund has dropped dramatically, and margins have expanded. This expanded margin is going to take care of the credit cost that is coming. So people will see a doubling of NPAs at a system level. Somewhere between 2 to 2.5 times what was pre-pandemic is likely to happen by the time this is over. Secondly, RBI came out with a host of measures that has soft landed the problem. So it could have been a crash landing, which was a worry last May and June. But there's been a soft landing with the various schemes that they brought out. Third is that RBI has kept the system very well hydrated on liquidity front. So today, if you go back and see, after ILFS, there was a major problem of liquidity and people were gasping for breath. That is not the situation right now. Ample liquidity is available at low cost. So to that extent, banks have 7 trillion worth of excess cash that they are sitting on. And NBFCs is a segment that banks love to finance. You may read about all the reticencies, etc. But the reality is that almost 15% of bank loans go to NBFCs. And generally NBFCs don't default. So banks generally like to finance NBFCs, and well-run NBFCs will continue to get well-oiled, money coming from the system. The good thing is that people have aggressively taken provision. So if you see, Bajaj Finance has taken 6,000 crores of provision, and ICICI Bank has taken 10,000 crores of provision. All lenders have taken large COVID provisions to ensure that whatever hit is coming their way is well provided for. So there are going to be no system shocks, that are likely going to come through. And overall, the economy has actually behaved better than what one thought. So one is that the recovery has been much faster, but as we all by now know that it's a K-shaped recovery. While some sectors have taken off really well, some people are on the wrong side of the K curve, and that segment, be it people in entertainment, people in restaurants, people in certain segments of businesses, are hotels, travel, are quite substantially affected. And a lot of those businesses may find the going difficult. The other thing is that there was a worry of major job losses that would happen through. That did not play out. So while a few companies had done a salary cut for 2-3 months during the pandemic, but all of that has got restored, and that is not something that has played out. So at a overall economy level, there is pain, but the pain is there across the world, some way or the other, and somehow the falling COVID numbers in India, is now putting us in a reasonable shape where a good recovery is possible.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let me take off one of your comments. This whole initiative that the government has taken to support the consumers and the borrowers and the banks through the moratorium, and then the restructuring, and then the financing of the interest on interest, and putting that money back into people's account. Do you think that was right? And was there enough done, or was there something they could have done a little differently to make the pain less?
So see, two parts of it, that whenever you want to do anything with the economy, you have two options. You either do it monetary or you do it fiscal. At the moment, the reality is that India's fiscal situation does not allow the government to really do what ideally should be done. So what you saw play out in UK, what you saw play out in Australia, what you saw play out in largely in Europe or in US, where the government directly sent checks home, and where small businesses were guaranteed, if they did not sack employees, they were guaranteed the entire salary being absorbed by the government. That are measures that one would like to happen, but in a country like India, it would have been difficult to do it. Already we are pushing double digit on fiscal deficit, and this is not. There was no room for the government to actually do that. So while economists have talked about it, realistically, in my opinion, it was not possible. And I think the government has done a wise thing by showing fiscal prudence and not going down that curve. But what they've done is that they've taken a series of monetary measures through RBI, which have had a salutary effect on things. Because see what happened. What happened was something which has never happened before. That even this never even happened during World War One or Two, where the economies of all countries were physically put to halt. Everything just stopped in its tracks. The ships were stopped. At ports. There were no flights going out of the country or coming back in. People were stranded wherever they were in. All businesses were shut down and people had to operate from home. So what we noticed during that time is something that has never happened in the world before, which was a complete stoppage of a momentum. And economy, as we know, is an elephant. That as long as it keeps moving, it has momentum. If it sits down, it needs a lot of energy to get up and start walking again. So what happened was people's cash flow suddenly froze, and your expenses continue, but your income drops. And this is something that affects small businesses the most. So the moratorium that was given ensured that your biggest expenditure, where you could default, which was your EMIs and your interest servicing, is something that they paused you and gave you 6 months time until you came out of the lockdown. And if as a government, if you announce lockdown, how do you expect the customers to keep paying? So there was no choice but to give moratoriums. And in fact, if you see in India, the moratorium taken has been a lot lesser than Southeast Asia or in most parts of the world. So the Indians have been prudent in taking moratorium, not by everyone took it. Secondly, today if you're seeing write-offs in Indonesia, in Vietnam, etc., people are taking knocks of between 20 to 50%. In India, people are only talking of 1-2% increase in NPAs that will come down through this. So to that extent, I think the resiliency has been good. Secondly, we entered the pandemic on a strong wicket on corporate side. Corporate balance sheets have been very strong and they've been very less leveraged, because RBI has been doing a cleaning up, for a long time, and there has been a lot of cleaning up that has already happened. And NPAs at the system level used to be 13.5%. That had come down to 7.5% before the pandemic. So to that extent, corporate balance sheets were strong, leverage was less, and therefore today what we are seeing is that corporate side we don't have a problem. Retail side, people needed some support, so the measures announced have been good and reasonable to that extent. However, for restoration, so there'll be two things. One is that restoring, has the business got restored, pre-pandemic to a large extent? It's a mixed answer. Some have, some haven't. Will there be some losses that will come the lenders' way? Certainly. But do they have the ability to withstand, that in their P&L? Yes. So that's where we are.
Great. That's a good perspective. So, this has really been like a black swan event. This whole pandemic has been like and it seems to be elongating. It took almost a year to go away, to start turning around. Do you see the risk appetite of banks, especially the smaller ones, the microfinance ones? Do you see them becoming a little more conservative? And how do these institutions even prepare for, God forbid, another such wave of situation?
So, in the last few years, there have been so many black swans, that white swans have become rare. So now black swans aren't so rare anymore. The thing is that ultimately today, what are you seeing happening? One is that your deposit growth is more than 2 times your loan growth. 2.5 times. So at a system level, people are getting flushed with, banks are getting flushed with deposits coming in, and loan growth has been very, very tepid and anemic. Now in such a situation, ultimately there is always pressure on banks to lend. Today banks have parked almost 6 trillion rupees in reverse repo at 3.5%. Obviously not a happy situation for them. But why are they not lending? They are not lending because they also want the waters to clear. They want to understand, because see, one of the challenges of lending has been that the whole risk model is built on continuity. That how do I give you money tomorrow, today, by relying on your yesterday to predict your tomorrow. Now, what has happened is that has come to a halt. Today when I go for a credit decisioning, I cannot say that he did well so far and therefore will continue to do well. I have to see what is the impact of this event that has happened on him, and whether he will be able to continue to do well in the future. So what happens is that whenever banks take a loss, there is some amount of conservatism that always creeps into decision making. And also the other thing is that banks have been more lending to the top end of corporates. So most of the credit is going to the PSUs, to the AAAs, and to the AAs. The double Bs and the triple Bs are finding the going that much more difficult. So there will be some cleansing that will happen, and some of the weaker players may not be able to make it through. So what the pandemic has done is that if you were a strong player, you are going to come out stronger. If you were a weak player with a weak business model pre-pandemic, pandemic will become one big reason why you'll go under.
Right. So let me switch this to another aspect of banking and financial services, which is the recent announcements or the internal report of the RBI, which talked about corporate houses starting banks. 2 days ago, there was a report that Reliance might look at it, for example. Of course, it's still an internal report, and I don't think RBI has clarified its public policy on that. But what is your view on that aspect of banking, the whole regulatory piece, and then couple that with some of the failures we've had on the cooperative side, for example, and corporate houses becoming banks or starting banks?
So the fundamental thing is that there are no models which are necessarily right or wrong. So you may look at bank as a model, NBFC as a model, cooperative banks as a model. It is not necessary that banking, if somebody becomes a bank, he becomes strong. There are as many badly run banks as there are well-run NBFCs as well. So there are well-run companies and well-run businesses, and there are poorly run businesses. And as it has shown that it is not necessary that a higher amount of supervision. RBI has been monitoring so many banks, and we have been seeing the failures come through in banking as well. So just because somebody becomes a bank, doesn't mean that that institution is safer or better, in some sense. So on the whole corporate bit, I think people have got a little carried away. I don't think RBI has yet reached a point where these licenses are going to be handed over. So it was an internal note, that it was a think tank, that put out that note. It is not a stated regulator policy yet. So I personally don't think that is something around the corner. And thirdly, even if it comes through, it is not necessarily good or bad. It is then how they are regulated once they come through. As long as there are Chinese walls, as long as there are strong regulatory supervision, and as long as the ownership is kept limited, as the RBI has managed to keep ownership limited in the hands of the promoter over a period of time. As long as they are able to do that, the system is well protected. So by entry of corporates into banks, even if it happens, in itself is neither good or bad. It's how then they are regulated from there.
Right. So another question, which I think is even a perennial win with all of us, is RBI or the regulators' view of NBFCs, right? So you always keep hearing that RBI doesn't want to expand the NBFC segment, but we need them. So where do you see? I mean, I don't think anyone doubts the value or the NBFCs bring, but where do you see that regulatory angle going? And now, as you know, even housing finance companies have been classified as a kind of NBFC, and RBI has taken over their regulation and recently issued a circular which talks about how they should be monitored, regulated, and supervised. Where do you see that whole NBFC piece going as we grow, and especially after the new life for all of us?
See, today, if you see the total lending done by private sector banks are about 30 trillion rupees, and retail, and NBFCs, have done upwards of 20 trillion. So to that extent, the NBFCs in India are actually doing, they are coolies of credit. They actually take the load of wholesale loans from nationalized banks and then take it down the line to small people. Now, why have NBFCs? So see, one of the problems is that there is too much of Western thought in India that we take it for granted. The Westerners talk of NBFCs as shadow banks. And when you say something is in a shadow, it sounds almost as if it is suspicious. Now, in India, it is not so. In India, NBFCs have actually done the hard work of the last mile connectivity with people. Now, if you see, there was no home loans before HDFC came in. Banks were not doing home loans. There was no microfinance before SKS came in. There was no gold loans before a Muthoot came in. Consumer durables, was not there until Bajaj pushed in and made something out of it. So there have been, used commercial vehicles, was something that Shriram invented. Now the point is that why does NBFCs do well in India? They do well in India because PSU banks, have done a suboptimal job in terms of reaching out to that customer segment. So there is no regulatory arbitrage. People keep talking, saying, is there a regulatory arbitrage? In fact, more stricter rules, in many ways apply to NBFCs than compared to banks. We are not allowed leverages of 10 times that a bank is allowed. We don't have SARFAESI, below 20 lakhs. So banks actually have it much better, and we do not have a last mile financial. So in the Reserve Bank, RBI, has ensured that it is the last man standing financier for banks. So that system is protected. So why do NBFCs exist? Now NBFCs exist because they actually serve a need of the customer. So as long as they serve the need of the customer, they will continue to exist. And every time this debate comes up, I've been seeing this debate since 1990s. Banks versus NBFCs. That debate picked up steam from 1997 when private sector banks came in. And then every time, the epitaphs have been written about the sector, and the sector only keeps emerging stronger after all of that. So as Mark Twain once said, the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated.
That's a good one. Yeah. Okay, let me move now as we, kind of leave the pandemic hopefully behind literally and in our conversation to technology, right? I mean, everybody says that 2030 has become 2020 because of the pandemic and lots of changes happening on technology. You hear about customer interaction, loan approvals and all without touching the customer at all physically, and digitalization and all this. Of course, that's the first stage. Then you move on to talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and analytics and big data. Big data has also become passe now in that sense. Do you see the real change happening at the ground level across the organizations, across the State Bank of India and the smallest microfinance company? Do you see the investment in technology being adequate? Because it's a changing investment all the time. As we are talking, technology is evolving. And the third important thing, which we tend to underplay, is the mindset of people in these banks, because they will have to reskill themselves. They're scared of losing jobs. Really, it's a question of reskilling yourself. So how do you see that whole thing panning out in the next 5-10 years?
So there are two challenges in India that keep us a little behind. One is that existing players who have already entrenched ownership of markets guard their market by not allowing innovation to happen. Now, if you see, one of the biggest changes was brought about, with what you were a part of in CIBIL, because when I used to do consumer lending in HDFC Bank before 1990, before 2000, for example, we had no credit bureau, and we were really going blind into financing a customer. We had no clue if the guy had defaulted on some other bank, that particular day. So that changed with CIBIL coming in, and with other bureaus then setting shop, and there being accurate information available about the customer. The second piece is that what Nilekani is working on with his iSpirit thing on Ocean, and on Sehmati. Now again, the existing entrenched players are blocking it, because they're saying, why should we give up our data? Now, what is important is that for a customer, his data should be available digitally for him to send to any lender of his choice. I may have a loan, I may have a bank account with X, I may have my income tax return somewhere, I may have my GST return somewhere. Why should all of this data be not digitally available for me to send it to any lender of my choice, regardless of where I'm banking at? Now, this is something, with Aadhaar coming through. So after CIBIL, Aadhaar became the second biggest change for banks to base their growth on. So that became the second big driver. And the third big driver, again, which is being resisted right now, as Aadhaar was in its time, is the OCEN network, and the Sehmati, which could be game changing. For example, for years in the United States, I can move from my home loan from Wells Fargo to JP Morgan on a phone call. I don't need to visit a branch. I don't need to sign documents. I don't need to have more charges and more cost. If some bank is offering me better facility, I can just change my loan across the counter. Now, why is this not done in India? Because our regulation has not yet kept pace. The entrenched players, it is not in their interest to allow this to happen. And that is why this has not happened. So some bold reforms are required. And I wish the Reserve Bank takes this into account and drives it. Some bold reforms are required. As a country, we need to cut down on our costs. So what is happening is that every time somebody moves his mortgage, there is a stamp duty implication. Now, the government also has to realize that ultimately it is punishing the same customer by charging stamp duty multiple number of times when he moves his home loan from one to the another. Why is he moving the home loan? Because his scores have improved, or because his lender is not passing on the rate benefit and somebody else is willing to lend him at a lower rate. Why should the government be charging him stamp duty again for doing what he's already done once, which is mortgaged the property, but to an institution A, now it is moving to an institution B. So a central repository like a demat account, there has to be a central repository from where these backend is possible. So now to move forward, technology as a lender, I have only two things that I am looking at: customers' ability to pay and customers' willingness to pay. There is nothing else that I'm looking at. Now, ability to pay, I can judge by all these data that I'm looking at the customer. If it is made available to me digitally, I can very quickly give an in principle approval to the customer. Willingness to pay depends on I may look at past behavior, I may look at his bureau scores, I may look at doing reference checks on the customer, or whatever it is that the institution wants to do. But for technology, technology has enabled many things to happen. But the reality is that I can do touch-free lending today. But if I do touch-free lending, I will not touch my money again. So the enabling infrastructure, in terms of, now we came up with section 138 where we said check bounce is a criminal offense. Very good. But today 40% of checks in the system are bouncing. Now, are we saying that 40% of Indians are actually committing a criminal offense? Technically, yes. These are all chargeable under section 138. But because the load has become so much on the courts, no order is being passed. So effectively, we have a law, but it has lost its teeth.
In fact, it has been decriminalized now. As you know, 138 has been decriminalized.
Yeah, because it had no meaning anyway. So it lost its teeth and it became irrelevant. So unfortunately, the point is that we pass laws with good intentions, but enabling infrastructure is sometimes missing.
But when we talk of technology, there is a whole group of people who are technically not as clued in as, say, another percentage of the population, either because of connectivity or mobility or whatever it is. Now, most of the lenders then want to play with the same group of people to lend to them and to balance transfer them. But there is, as all of us have believed, a huge untapped population. How will technology reach them, or are we still talking last mile brick and mortar with that batch of people, which is the large volume, the other India, if I can call it that?
So see, one of the biggest enabler has been because one thing is very clear, that for any serious credit, you can do small amounts of credit to using mobile phone information, how many contacts somebody has, scrubbing somebody's phone, etc. You can probably give out small amounts of loan, maybe do a consumer durable, maybe do a small value personal loan. But for any serious credit to happen, the customer has to come into the banking system, and the government recognized this, and Jan Dhan that was brought in is another big enabler for this to happen. Because under Jan Dhan, we may not have realized this, but 40 crore accounts have got opened. Now, so 40 crore Indians have been brought into a formal system. They may not yet have balances, but even the balances are building pretty well there. So they may not, all of them may not have yet balances, but at least the formal print of the customer is coming into the banking system. And once that comes in, the bank's ability to then sell loans to the customer with the confidence, keeps going up. Second is that Indians have actually adapted to technology quite well. When I remember when NSE came in, the brokers used to operate on the Bombay Stock Exchange on a live stream basis. And at that point of time, when NSE came in, they said, India, this will not work. This kind of technology, how will these brokers adapt to? And the fact is that NSE did very well. and everything moved out. Similarly, today, look at the transactions that are happening on UPI. People who never use checkbooks are now transferring money using the simple QSR codes or WhatsApp money transfers with mobile phones on UPI. So people have now so just as people did not use fixed telephony and straight moved into mobile phones. Similarly, we are seeing that people in India never used desktops, and straight moved into laptops. We are seeing the same trend play out, that in banking, people are now jumping the queue, and people who never use checkbooks are now doing money transfers without using checkbooks. They have bypassed that the entire middle layer. So WhatsApp, is something that has ensured that smartphone penetration in India has been reaching now a substantial tipping point. So even the blue collar workers, even people in the farm are now having smartphones. So the smartphone penetration in India with Android devices cost coming down. So mobility, technology, and banking services riding on it is the troika that is going to take this whole thing ahead. So identification of businesses by finding footprints electronically of customers, because today what is happening is that a lot of customers are coming in through advertisements on Facebook, advertisements on Instagram. So they are using all of that. They may not be using the traditional services. So to that extent, identification of customers which are not yet in the formal banking net, finding out good customers among them to lend using alternative and prime data, and lending to these customers. I mean, companies like us are founded on that particular premise, that we are finding customers who are in the underserved segment. They may not be necessarily underbanked, but they are underserved. They may have a bank account, but they have not yet had a commercial loan yet. And that is proving to be a good experiment, because one sees, even at a CIBIL level, one sees that it is very strange that -1 CIBIL behaves same or better than 750. So somewhere people who have not yet been over leveraged, is a good segment to get into. And lenders are when they find something working, then they go after it in a bigger way.
So, this is a question I can't resist. It wasn't planned, but because you mentioned CIBIL, and given my background, I have to come back to the credit bureaus as an industry. Do you think we've had the credit bureaus in this country now for about 15 to 20 years, and it's very baby steps compared to the US, which have been around for a long, long time? Do you think the banks have adapted well and actually leveraging bureaus as they could or should, or are we still playing around with 750 is a good score and 740 is not a good score kind of thing?
Yeah, so see, the banks have been a little conservative in terms of their approach on this, and unfortunately, what has happened is that while a bad CIBIL is denied credit, a good CIBIL is not given low rates of interest. So the unfortunately, in India, the net interest margin of banks are the highest in the world. Nowhere in the world, banks make this kind of margins, which is why, despite making so many NPAs, banks are still profitable. The simple reason is that the good customers are overpaying for the bad customer who's not going to pay. So today the reality is that a lot of fintechs and a lot of new age players have tried to use CIBIL a little more intelligently, but the fact is their cost of funds is so high that the rates of interest are almost bordering usurious rates of interest. Right. So to that extent, while a lot of innovation has happened, a lot of usage of bureau scores, strings within the scores are looked at, not just the absolute score, but all the strings within the scores are looked at. But the fact is that while the bad is being kept out, the good is not being rewarded.
Because most people think bureaus are here to catch the crooks, and I think they are here to reward the good guys also. And you need to, like, for example, I'm paying the same interest rate on my credit card as somebody else, and my score is 850, for example.
And also the other unfortunate part is that unlike a CRISIL or an ICRA, the rating is not for an absolute amount. Yes. So so somebody may have just taken a 30,000 rupee loan and paid back, and his score looks good. Now, to that guy, is the guy good enough to be given a 30 lakh? The answer is no. Yeah. But the biggest thing, as you rightly said, is credit cards. That why should my APR on credit cards be high? If my score is good, if I behaved well all through time, why should the interest that I pay be the same as the guy who does not have that kind of a track record. But unfortunately, that's how it is.
Yeah. Okay. The other angle which comes in all this with data sharing and all that we talked about is this hype around privacy, partly true, partly overhyped. My data, privacy. In fact, Europe has become obsessive about privacy and sharing of data. Australia started credit bureaus with a negative, in fact. Now, and you will always find activists coming in and talking about privacy and my data and all that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, you can, as you rightly said, if I am a medical records and I want to release them to a doctor sitting in the US, I should be authorized, I should be able to authorize someone to do it. Where do you see privacy coming into all of this? And do you see it being contrarian to this whole movement? Or do you see it supplementing and complementing that entire thing?
See, now we are living in what social media has done is that it has put us in a very opinionated world. So, people have very, very strong opinions, and, the cancel culture, is playing out everywhere. So the reality is that, while we doubt the authenticity and the sturdiness of Aadhaar, we are very happy sharing our credit card information to a random website, which has doesn't even have SSL certification behind it. So unfortunately, human behavior, is pretty strange, and the privacy debate will continue to rage on. But the fact is that good systems, have taken enough precautions. For example, the Aadhaar, CEO went to Supreme Court and said that to hack a Aadhaar system will take a supercomputer 12.5 billion years to hack it, which is the age of the universe. So technically, one shouldn't be worried, but opinions are opinions.
Okay, so last couple of questions before we take questions from everyone. If you had the power to change anything in the banking system, 3 changes or 2 changes, what are the 2 or 3 key changes you would bring in if you were the RBI? When we were in school, we were said, are you a teacher for a day? So if you're the RBI governor and the finance minister rolled into one for a day, what would you do?
See, one big thing is that unfortunately, while banking is a service business, they have taken the focus of services. The focus is more on profitability. The focus is more on absolute earnings. So somewhere, you will find so many customers, but it is very rare to find a happy bank customer. So that one thing, is an Achilles heel for banks. That while banks have been able to differentiate themselves on technology, products, distribution, they have not been able to really differentiate themselves on services. So the big challenge for banks, is to be able to achieve that. The second is that if I was in a position of power, I would make it easier for customers to transfer loans from one to the other, to transfer data from one to the other, and break down the silos that banks have created. For example, if I'm banking with an X bank and I have the full track record, why should that track record not be available on tap to a Y bank, from where I want to take a loan? So today, the reality is that that is not something that is easily available in the system. So I think Sehmati and Ocean, that Nilekani is trying to bring, I would probably mandate it like Aadhaar. And that could be the single biggest change, that if a customer wants to move a mortgage loan from X to Y, it should happen over a phone call rather than him having to do multiple documents and an increased cost there. So the transacting cost has to come down. Good customers have to get a loan at lower rates of interest. That should be the incentive for them to stay good. And the bad customers, have to be kept out, and protect the system. Right now, the good customers are paying for the bad customers' bill. This is like going to a restaurant and saying, this guy can't pay, so your bill is now inflated. How would you like it? But that's what's happening. So if I was a regulator, I would want to change that.
All right, Aseem. So I think, this is very interesting, and this could go on, but I think we need to draw the line somewhere. We have about half a dozen questions, but one last question for you. What is Aseem's de-stressor in life? I can see it all at the back behind you. But what does Aseem do besides starting new banks at a stage of life, what does Aseem at a personal level do to de-stress besides all the books which are lying behind you?
So reading, travel, and music, have been three big things, and the big de-stressor is when I play the bansuri, but that stresses everyone else at home. So sometimes your de-stressor becomes stressor for other people.
True. All right, thanks, Aseem. I'm going to shoot that. There's some questions, so I'm going to kind of go to them and we can answer them as much as we can, and then we'll see. So the first question actually has come from a guy who I know. His name is Rushikesh Mehta, and he actually wanted to meet you because he's working with iSpirit and he wanted to do something. And his question probably is answered because he says, will you be using OCN platform to facilitate digital lending? And I think you answered it subsequently. So I'm going to pass that question. Another question we have from someone called Anita Ravi Shankar. Her query is related to customer service. Don't you think the focus has completely shifted from service to sales? She mentions a bank, but I'm not going to mention that. Branches, for example, have very limited authority for delivering services, but can sell you almost anything.
Oh, that so I touched upon that briefly.
Yes.
That banking is a services business, and unfortunately, it has behaved like it is selling products. That needs to change.
Okay. Another question that's come is that if the pandemic is a financial cyclone, post cyclone, the market reality bottom top payment cycle time has graduated from 90 to almost 140 to 150 days. Banks are maximized only to an extent of 90 to 110 days. How do you foresee this gap being bridged?
So the turnaround time is something that has been a challenge for banks, and people have used straight through technology to move things faster. But what the pandemic has done is that it has shaken confidence. So one isn't as sure as one was, because you are still managing the battles of the past portfolio that you have, and that has made you reticent to go out and lend. But I think that is changing, and over the next couple of months, you're already seeing home loans come back to its previous levels, and the other products also should come back there.
All right. Another question is that as per the new RBI regulations, any company having a line of credit with a bank is not allowed to have multiple current account relationships with the rest of the bank. What are your views on this regulation?
See, again, I think it was a knee-jerk, reaction to what happened with Altico. And while the again all regulations have good intentions, but the as they say, the road to hell is paved with great intentions. So the this actually is not a very good step. It's a retrograde step, and it has created a lot of confusion. But none of us actually know how these things are actually going to play out. As of now, even banks are confused. Banks are asking each other, how this will work through. But the reality is that is there a need? There have been frauds that have happened. Money has got diverted out. So is there a need to monitor this? Yes. But is the solution, doing it through a particular bank only? How is it that going to make any difference? I don't know.
And that is contrary to what you have been saying, that I can move from bank A to bank B anytime I want to.
Yes. Unfortunately, this is binding NBFCs down to their principal lenders, but that will not necessarily mean the supervision of the accounts is going to be better. It will just be an administrative difficulty, because see, there are practical issues, that we use certain banks for certain geographies, they are better there. We use certain banks for certain products, which need faster turnaround time. For example, in a gold loan. Now, when I deliver a gold loan, I need to put the money in the customer's account in 10 minutes. Now, I can't do that if the bank is not ready with its infrastructure. I can't do it with a bank. You cannot force me to do it with a bank X, which is not able to deliver the service level that I would want. But we'll have to adjust that.
The next one is something to do with farmers and the farm segment. The question is that farm segment in India is really largely cash driven. Loans to farmers still have to be collected by cash, and that's a challenge. Do you have any suggestion on how to push non-cash modes for this particular segment?
So see, we tried many things. For example, in HDFC Bank, long back, we had put milk to money ATMs, where we said that near the dairy, where the customer is coming to pour milk, we'll put an ATM there. We linked it to the dairy's infrastructure. And there was the dairy had put in a fat tester and a water tester. So as soon as somebody came to pour milk, we would test the level of water, quantity and fat. And Amul, with whom we had tied up, would calculate the amount that it owes the dairy farmer, and we would directly debit Amul and put the money into the customer's account. And then there was an ATM right there, and told the customer that, okay, you have a debit card now, you can use it or whatever. But the behavior of people is that as soon as they got it, they withdrew all the money out from the ATM. So that market, see, as a bank, you cannot change behavior, but you can influence behavior by making things possible. So what is happening is that people like Paytm, people like PhonePe, etc., are doing a very good job going out to small merchants who, because banks have a problem that their terminals are very expensive, 2.5% commission, 3.5% commission, plus the cost of the terminal, the rent of it. So these guys have just put out simple QSR codes, and that is doing a good job. So with these kind of enabling infrastructure, the behavioral change should happen. But the fact is, statistics is pointing to the contrary. After demonetization, the absolute level of M3 in the economy has gone up. People are actually holding more cash than they were before demonetization.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions. So quickly, one of them is, hi Aseem, what is your view on the NUE entities? Do you think we need many alternatives to NPCI?
See, personally, I think why do we really need so many alternatives? Now, what is happening is that instead of making one strong, we are going to make. Look at what happened to credit bureaus. Did we really need 6 credit bureaus? I'll let Mr. Mehta answer that. And how are 6 credit bureaus actually better than 1 or 2 good credit bureaus? So somewhere, if banks are allowed to gang up, as they are thinking of, saying maybe HDFC Bank, SBI, if these big fellows start their own, then NPCI's volumes, will take a hit. Now, NPCI has done a very good job of building what it has. It is one of the most credible institutions to come out of India. I think we should support it and enable it to do more rather than bring unnecessary competition. It's not going to help anyone.
Okay, the next one, at the point discussed on rating on retail customers, how do you foresee the origination industry where the third-party sourcing is leading to multiple logins and sanctions for a customer who is not eligible to beat the system? Is the direct marketing agency, the DMA channel, also move to phygital at some point of change, and would that bring about a change?
See, the issue is that today, why did we go for phygital? Is because customers do not have digital documents. Today, if you give me a bank account statement which is in PDF format for the last 6 months, if you give me your income tax downloaded from the direct tax site, if you give me your GST returns directly downloaded out, I am able to give you a loan approval because my entire bureau scores are online. So I just take your PAN number, I take your Aadhaar validation, and I move ahead. Now, unfortunately, what is happening is that customers do not have access to all this digital data. So if there's a repository, then this can move faster. So right now, what is happening is that there are DSAs and channel partners who are actually converting this data into digital and then sending out to 100 lenders and then say, wherever it goes to, I will make my commission. So that leads to duplication of effort everywhere. But one of the problems of Indian businesses is what I call the A1 Chikki problem, where you go to Lonavala, one guy is doing well in Chikki, 25 people will come saying we are the original A1 Chikki, and everyone's business model gets warped, So unfortunately, there's a lot of wastage that is happening in the system because of this.
Okay, so last 3 questions, and we have 3 minutes, so it's like literally a minute a question. What challenges do you see in adoption of the account aggregator framework, and are NBFCs and smaller banks ready for that? And when do you expect we can have AA becoming common like UPI?
So NBFCs and small guys will love it. The big guys won't like it, and they will, as they are, resisting it. So the problem is not going to be the small fellows. In fact, we are getting technologically ready for it. But the problem, because we are the gainers, the problem will be the people who will look at themselves as losers in this, where they will have to share data with us of customers they have acquired over time. So the real challenge is going to be the big guys, but if the regulator drives them the way regulator drove bureaus, the way the regulator drives many large events like Aadhaar implementation, if the regulator drives it, adoption will come. If the regulator stays out of the game, which he's been doing so far, then it will take forever.
So the next one, I think you answered, but I'll just go read it out, and in case you want to supplement your response. What is the biggest obstacle to adoption of technology and innovation within organizations? And what is the biggest gap or gaps that you think technology can fill or should fill immediately?
See, the biggest gap always is that the human mind sticks on to status quo. If I've done something and that has worked, if I'm successful, then I question, why should I now change? It has worked for me so far. Why should I do this change? So therefore, change has always come by not from the incumbent. All uncomfortable change has come from a new player who has come and tried to change. So electric cars, could not have been invented and moved in a General Motors factory. It had to come out from a Tesla, who's saying I'm only going to do electric. So some of these technology changes, always come from somebody who's a challenger to incumbents, because incumbents with legacy systems, become like elephants, which it's too difficult for them to run.
Okay, so the next one is apparently from a colleague of yours who had worked with you at SBFC, and his question is rural India penetration through digital lending. As there is an immense presence of MSMEs in rural India, how do you see getting to them? And because of the lack of financial infrastructure at the rural end of the country.
So today, the strategy what we are adopting is that we want to go at district levels with physical presence, and below the district we will go through electronic channels only, because you can't. There are 6.5 lakh villages in India where banks have probably reached 100,000 to 150,000 of those villages, and some of the other villages are so small it is not viable to have a separate bank infrastructure there. So that last mile, you will have to find ways in which you use technology, but you may use technology. The customer should be ready to use technology to give you those documents. So what it will mean is that the last mile physical connect will still have to happen on the ground.
Okay, I think the next question you kind of addressed again, that how will loan syndication between banks and NBFCs work as a business model? I think this is the co-lending piece that,
So that is a very powerful, because see, there is a 2 trillion rupees a year securitization market that happens. So NBFCs anyway securitize more assets than what they can stomach in their balance sheet. So to that extent, there is a 2 trillion opportunity a year on co-origination. So players, so we have, for example, tied up with ICICI Bank, where we are co-originating almost 20% of our lending with ICICI Bank. So this is something which is a very powerful product, and it brings 2 very big advantages together. That the NBFC has an ability to go deep into the market and originate, and the bank has a balance sheet to lend. So and the NBFC has a struggle of balance sheet. So it's a win-win model, but it's challenging to do because technological implementation, API integrations, is notoriously difficult to achieve. So it's going to take a while for it to develop, but that's the way forward.
And the last question is, should digital transactions be subsidized to accelerate adoption?
No, see, the convenience is the driver for digital adoption. You don't need subsidy if you find that this is a better way to do things. You really, nobody told you to do WhatsApp, or nobody subsidizes you to use WhatsApp. Nobody really sold Zoom to us. So the good thing with digital technology is that if it is good, if it works, if it makes your life better, simpler. Who came and explained to you how to use Amazon? But everyone does. So convenience, and ease, and experience. So user interface, UI is the code word. See, for example, even in learning, Salman Khan Academy came up. He didn't go and market it to anyone. On that. But if it is good, if the content is good, if people find value in it, then you don't even need to go and market. People will come to you. The good thing about digital is that the whole world opens up. There's an app people download, and use. So if you focus on customer experience, that's good.
All right. Thanks a lot, Aseem. This was great. And I think you've timed it well. I think everybody who participated has gained a lot from your insight. Many thanks. 2 quick things. This will all be available on recording on our website, on YouTube and all that. And the next session, about a month from now, will be on credit information. So look forward to that. Thank you very much, Aseem, again.
Thank you.